Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for what I already know is going to be an informative and entertaining presentation. In the audience, we have folks, primarily relatives of the Sussin, Shussin, Shussin, Sussin clan, and other interested parties from Africa, Europe, Australia, and the US. I thank you for accommodating a wide range of time zones. I'm Barbara Levin, a proud member of the Abraham Shussin lineage. It is my honor to introduce this webinar that will transport many of you back to your childhood memories of hearing stories of our kin around the world. Even if it doesn't do that, it is guaranteed that you'll learn much. I also want to thank some of our special guests joining us for this webinar. Those of you from the Jewish Genealogical Societies, old friends, historians, and beloved members of Beverley's family. I also realize that some of you might span a few of these categories. Technically, let me explain what will happen here for the next 45 minutes or so. Everyone will be muted while Beverley speaks. In your control panel on the right side of the screen, you have the ability to write down a question in the question panel. You may also wish to, quote, raise your hand, unquote, which is a toggle key with a hand, to ask a question, or write a note that you have a question. When Beverley is finished with her presentation, I will unmute you to ask your question. I will make you aware of the queue as best as I can. If you need to, there is also a chat panel if you wish to make a comment for anyone or just one person attending. I am recording this entire webinar, and each of you and anyone who is registered will receive a link to view it again. It is such a pleasure to introduce Beverley Sossen Olsberg, who is truly our family's North Star. She is the keeper of the tree and has been the diligent scribe, supported by her wonderful husband Peter, of the changes every family sustains. I know you're going to enjoy this, and I'm going to stop talking so we can sit back and enjoy this together. Here's Beverley.
Thank you, Barbara. Before I start, I would like to explain that it will just be the illustrations that will come up on your screen. Therefore, you will only hear my voice, you will not see me. For obvious reasons, I will not have time to linger on the illustrations, particularly some of the documents and family trees. But when you receive a recorded copy of this talk in a few days' time, you will be able to pause on these illustrations yourself so as to study them in more detail if you wish. So for those that don't know me, my name is Beverley Olsberg, and I am descended from Benzion Sossen, the only one of the 10 Shussin, Sussin, Sossen siblings who emigrated from Tels in Lithuania to South Africa. We don't really know why Benzion went to South Africa when all his brothers emigrated to the United States. It is kind of odd that he went off on his own as far away from his siblings as he could. I would love to know why, but I doubt we ever will. I believe this is the only photograph that our family have of Benzion. I am giving this presentation as I consider myself a bit of an amateur genealogist. I have been researching my family history on both my paternal and maternal sides on and off for the past 23 years. It so happens that all 4 of my grandparents come from Lithuania, and in particular the area around Tels. Tels was a major city in Lithuania. It was sometimes pronounced Telshi, T-E-L-S-H-I, but is now referred to as Telsi, T-E-L-S-I-A-I, which is the Lithuanian spelling and pronunciation. So here's a map of Lithuania, and I wanted to point out to you, there is Telsi. Here is Memel, it's now called Klaipeda, and that's where they would board the ship to leave Lithuania to go to Europe and further afield. So they really didn't have that far to go, which must have made it easier. Down here is Kaunas, because it was the Gubernia of Kovna, that whole area. And then over here is Vilna, which looks as if it's outside Lithuania, but in fact, this now is in Lithuania. This was in 1939, where it says here it was ceded, this region was ceded to Lithuania in October 1939. Anyway, let's get on. So very briefly, my own family background. Benzion married my grandmother, Cecilia Warees, in Tulls in 1897. Their firstborn was Isaac in 1898, followed by another son, Chaim, in 1899, and a daughter, Chaimera, in 1904. Sadly, both Chaim and Chaimera died as infants. Soon after, in 1904, Benzion left Tulls on his own for South Africa. And you can see South Africa right at the bottom of Africa. However, because I know that my father, Harry, was born in Tulls in December 1907, I am assuming that Benzion must have returned to Tulls in order for my father to be conceived. I also know that Elchonon, Benzion's father, died in 1906. Perhaps Benzion, being the eldest son, returned to Tulls because of his father's death. I also found the record of Benzion returning the second time to South Africa by ship in 1908. My grandmother Celia then followed Benzion a few months later when Isaac was 10 and my father was just a few months old. The family settled in a small town called Mafeking, 180 miles northwest of Johannesburg, which is about here near the border with Botswana. They had another 3 children in Mafeking, Louis, Janie, and Philip. There were 22 years between Isaac, the eldest, and Philip, the youngest, quite a gap. The children grew up in Mafeking, but as an adult, my father spent most of his life in a town called Livingstone in Northern Rhodesia, which is in Central Africa. That is where he met my mother and where I was born and raised. However, when Northern Rhodesia gained independence from Britain in 1964, the name Northern Rhodesia changed to Zambia. So Livingstone was about here where I've got the cursor on the border between, which was then Northern Rhodesia and Southern Rhodesia, and now called Zambia and Zimbabwe. I left Zambia when I was 18 to go to college in London. A few months later, my sister Marion joined me, and 5 of us Rhodesian girls shared a Mews cottage in London for nearly 2 years. During this time, I met my husband Peter, who is British. We married in 1966, having a civil marriage in Zambia, followed by a religious wedding in Zimbabwe. Rather unusual, but that's another story. We made our home in London, where we went on to have 2 children, Simon and Isabel. They were both raised and educated in London. After university, Simon went to Israel, where he met his American wife-to-be, Malka. He then followed Malka to Boston, where they married in 1993, and since then have lived in Newton, which is part of the greater Boston area. They have 3 children, Oshri, Eden, and Lev. Isabel and her newlywed British husband, Rob, moved to California in 1999 so that Isabel could do her MBA at Stanford. They kept saying they were coming back to England in 2 years, but in the meantime went on to have their 2 children, Alex and Anna, in San Francisco. They too decided to make their home in the US, and they now live in Piedmont in the Bay Area of San Francisco. My only sibling, my older sister Marion, still lives in London. So as I tell people, I'm definitely one of those wandering Jews. My father was born in Lithuania, I was born in Zambia, my children were born in England, and my grandchildren in the United States. 4 generations from 3 different continents besides 4 totally different countries across the globe. So getting back to family history, around 1992, just after my father passed away, I became very interested in my family history on both my maternal and paternal side, and so I joined the Jewish Genealogical Society of Great Britain. This is typical of descendants becoming interested in their family history after their parents have passed away, when it is too late to ask more questions. So if you have elderly relatives, my advice is interview them now, don't wait. A couple of years later, in 1995, my sister Marion and I were able to tour Lithuania with two experienced genealogists. We started off in Vilnius, where we visited the Lithuanian State Archives. And this is a photograph of myself and then Marion with Galina Baranova, who was the head archivist, and really, as you can see by the smile on her face, very helpful and very nice indeed. I gave Galina what little information that I had then, and over the next 6 months she researched the Sussins, as well as my other three grandparents, and I was extremely fortunate in that she found hundreds of records for all four of my ancestors. Through these records, I've been able to put a lot of my family history together. So now let's start with the correct spelling of our family name. Is it Shussin, Shussin, Sussin, or Sussin? All I can tell you is that throughout my research in the archives, 99% of the names in the records are spelt as either Shussin, S-H-O-S-S-E-N, sometimes Sussin with just one S, and sometimes with two S's. I don't believe there were any written with a U, as in Shussin, Shussin, or Sussin. Sorry, guys. Here's a copy of some of the records that I received, and you will see there's Marcus, son of Gersh. Well, that was actually Elchonon's brother, but you'll see Shussin and Gersh Shussin, and then Yankel, that's Jacob, son of Honel, our grandfather, son of Mark, a coachman, and Toby was born on the 27th of November. So I have got some of the birth certificates. That's the twins, Marcus and Beryl. Beryl is Barney. And then sadly, Marcus, Barney's twin, died of inflammation of the brain when he was 13. And that's Honel when he died of a rupture, etc., etc. But I just really wanted to show you the spelling. So where did the family originate from in Lithuania? Actually, I'm going to go back because I don't want you to see that yet. They definitely came from Tels. Marion and I visited many shtetl in northwestern Lithuania, including Tels. We were fortunate in having the opportunity of visiting the only one and last surviving Jew in Tels, who told me that he had heard of a Sussin at some point, but was quite vague and could not give me any details. We visited the cemetery, but there were no longer any visible tombstones in the name of Sussin. However, quite recently, when I was researching the records through the internet myself, I was totally amazed to find an EZ or Z, depending where you're from, Shussin in the records, born 1878, who died in Vilnius in 1961, aged 83. So that's very late because we presumed people either left or perished. I never knew there was a Sussin still in Lithuania. I'm assuming that is why the last survivor in Tels felt he knew of a Sussin. He or she definitely wouldn't have been part of our immediate family, but it is quite probable that he or she were part of the extended Sussin family. We know from the records that Elchonon did have a brother, Gersh, and Cliff and I have actually met some of Gersh's descendants now living in Israel. Maybe those cousins could shed more light on this. So now some information that I found in the Tels archival records. According to statistics, in 1797, there were a total of 2,500 residents in the town of Tels, of which 1,600 were Jewish. That's 66% of the town's population. Compare that to where we all live today. Through the archives, I found several Shussins born in Tels as early as 1770, so they were included in this very early statistic. That is almost 250 years ago. About 100 years later, in 1870, the town had more than doubled to 6,500 residents, of which 4,500 were Jewish. That's 68%, even a higher percentage than before. According to the records, between 1854 and 1909, there were 72 births in the name of Sussin actually recorded. And bear in mind that not all births were recorded. I never found my own grandfather, Bension's, birth certificate. The Sossins at 72 were the sixth highest name out of a total of 1,000 births. So the Sossins were obviously a very prominent family in Tells during the 18th and 19th centuries. So from whom are we descended? So here's a photo of Elchonon and Taubeleah, my great-grandparents. Elchonon, sometimes referred to as Chonon, and Taubeleah were the parents of the 6 siblings that we today are descended from. That is, the 5 brothers, as well as some of Gitamira's descendants, who was a sister, and I'll go into that a little later. But we can go back even further, as we now know that Elchonon's parents were Marcus and Sheva, his grandparents were Leza and Leah, his great-grandparents were Shalom and Rivka, and his great-great-grandfather was Gesel. So this is a family tree I put together of those ancestors. So for me personally, Gesel would be my 6 times grandfather, going back 7 generations. I have not been able to find a record of Gesel's actual birth or where he was born, nor do we know exactly when our ancestors arrived in Tells and from where they originally came from. However, we do know that Shalom was born in Tells in 1770, Leza in 1801, Marcus in 1825, Elchonon in 44, Benzion in 73, and my father in 1907. Elchonon died in 1906, aged 62, from a rupture. He was a coachman, as he was his son Jacob, known as Yankel in Lithuania. His other sons, Abe, Barney, and Charlie, were tailors. Charlie was known as Zalkin. It is recorded that Charlie, at the young age of 16, contributed to the upkeep of his widowed mother, Taubeleah, as did Barney, who was a little older. It is also recorded that a cousin Gabriel was the post offer keeper in Tells, and quite a few members of the extended Sussin family were butchers. So now this is another record that I found. It was done in 1890, it records 1897, and the 2 people I've highlighted, the top one is Gersh, and the one below is Chonon, our great-grandfather, and they were 2 brothers. In these 2 records, Elchonon is recorded as well-to-do, with household duties, although his brother Gersh was recorded as poor and a worker. Perhaps this is why Elchonon was able to help his children emigrate, as Abe, the first to go, emigrated just 4 years later in 1901. I have another record here which is a bit faint, but you'll be able to look at more closely at a later stage. This record shows that Elchonon's widow, Taubeleah, my great-grandmother, who was just 59 when Elchonon died, married a second time to a widower of 82, Chaim Geselovich. Taubeleah died just 5 years later in 1912 of apoplexy. I often wondered what that was, and apparently it's called a stroke. And now the 10 children of Elchonon and Taubeleah. Now again, this isn't that clear, but when you look at it later, I hope you will be able to work it out, or I could send you something. Elchonon and Taubeleah had altogether 10 children, including 1 set of twins. 2 of the siblings died as infants. A third sibling, Marcus, who was a twin to Barney, died at 13 from an inflammation of the brain, as you saw in the previous records. Elchonon and Taubeleah only had 2 surviving daughters, Gitamira and Tzira. A third died as an infant. Both these daughters married and remained in Lithuania with their parents and children, whereas the sons all emigrated. Both Gitamira and Tzira died in Tells before the Holocaust. Fortunately, 5 of Gitamira's children made it to the USA, but 4 others who remained perished in Tells at the hands of the Nazis and their Lithuanian collaborators. Fortunately, 3 of Sarah's children emigrated to Israel before the Holocaust, but 1 son, together with his father, Sarah's late husband, also perished in the Holocaust in Tells. 2 of Sarah's children went on to have descendants who are still living in Israel. I did manage to correspond with Sarah's daughter, Chaya Apriaski, in 2001, who wrote me a wonderful letter explaining the very sad story as to what had happened to her family that remained in Tells. She also mentions that her mother became very ill, and it was her brother Barney who sent money from the US, which enabled her to go to Germany to see a particular doctor there. But sadly, they were unable to do anything to save her. But it's nice to know that Barney was so generous and helped his sister. So we have now covered those 5 of the original 10 siblings, leaving the remaining 5 sons. The 4 who emigrated to the US, Jacob, Abe, Barney, and Charlie, and the 5th, my grandfather Bension, to South Africa. We think that the 5 brothers that emigrated from Lithuania all left between 1901 and no later than 1908. They often guess their birth dates, so it is not easy to be that accurate. You will see on their census forms that they say about for their birth year. The very first to leave in 1901 was Abe, aged about 18. So there's his 1910 census details. 3 years later, in 1904, we know that Bension left for South Africa, and I believe Barney made his way to the US. And that's Barney's 1910 census details. Soon after, Jacob followed with his wife Bessie and I think 2 of his children. We think that perhaps he was accompanied by his youngest brother Charlie. Not sure if Charlie came with Jacob or came separately. Both Bension, age 32, and Jacob, age 30, were already married with children when they emigrated. This is now Jacob's census, which is 10 years later again. And it states, you can see at the bottom, that he was a peddler in the junk industry. And I think Rose and Joseph, the 2 eldest children, were born in Tells and the others in Minneapolis. And now this is going on to the 1930 census, which is Charlie's details. And this says he was born about 1892 and came to the US in 1905, which makes him 13 when he came, which I'm not sure, but it could be. This census states that in 1930 he was a manager in a garment factory, and in the city director it says he was a tailor. I think some of that information is on the other side, but I haven't done everything. Abe and Barney were both about 18 years old, and Charlie perhaps 16 when they left. The 3 brothers, Abe, Jacob, and Charlie, as well as the 5 children of Gita Mira, who left Lithuania several years later, all settled in Minneapolis. Again, we don't know why they actually went there. Probably because there were some other Tells brethren who encouraged them to come. It was only Barney who settled in Kingston, New York. So now moving on from Tells to Mafeking, South Africa. In 1904, aged 32, Bension left Lithuania for South Africa, and after living in Cape Town for a short while, he ended up in Mafeking. My guess is he chose Mafeking because either there were other Tells landsmen living there, or the town needed a bootmaker or general dealer. It is recorded that in 1904, when he arrived, there were just 39 Jews living in Mafeking out of a total population of 21,000 with just 2,500 Europeans. So coming from Tells, which was 68% Jewish when he was living there, he now finds himself as a minority of 1.6% Jewish. Quite a change for him, and one has to presume he did not yet speak the English language. My father once told me that he was told that as an infant he was lost in a very big fire in Tells. Years later, I actually found a record that states that my grandmother's house was destroyed in the famous fire in Tells in 1908. And there you are. And actually the one above, Gersh was my grandfather's, Hanan's brother. So, you know, they probably lived near each other, and both their houses were destroyed in that fire. It was very soon after the fire that my grandmother and her 2 sons left Tells to join Bension in South Africa. So now, these 2 next illustrations, so there's one page and the second page, are a timeline that I have put together with the information that I have, and I hope you will be able to look through this at your leisure once you have a recording of this talk. So you'll see I've given their birth years, the marriage, death, and immigration. Interestingly enough, all of my grandmother's siblings also emigrated to the US, and it was well known that she was very unhappy about going to South Africa rather than the United States. Her family were also well established in Tells, and their name was Warees. So to further my research about Benzion, I visited Mafeking in 2002 and found a statement in the Mafeking Daily newspaper that claims that an application for a general dealer's license was granted to Benzion in 1908. So now, this is a copy of Benzion's application form for naturalization in 1909, which lists his occupation as general dealer and bootmaker and states that he had already been living in South Africa for 4.5 years. It says that he commenced his business in 1905. This is where I got the information as to exactly when Benzion first arrived in South Africa. I never knew my grandfather, as he passed away well before I was born, aged 57 in 1929. Other than what I have found in the records, we, the grandchildren, know very little about him, as it seems our fathers hardly spoke about him. I don't know how much more Janie, my dad's younger sister, knew. So now going on to my father, Harry Sussin. My father, together with his older brother Isaac, attended the convent school in Mafeking. From an early age, my father was very musical and became an accomplished violinist. At the age of 13, he received a Trinity College of Music certificate with honors from his school. So there you are, you can see it's dated 1921, and this was amongst my father's possessions. Mafeking had a small Jewish community, and both boys had their bar mitzvahs there. When Isaac finished school and was in his late teens, he first went to Botswana and then moved on to Southern Rhodesia. He married Fanny and had 4 children and settled in Bulawayo, Southern Rhodesia, now called Zimbabwe. He had a farm as well as a liquor store. His eldest son, Leon, lives in Melbourne, Australia, and sisters Barbara and Pam live in Johannesburg. Sadly, their brother Michael passed away earlier this year. After my father left school at 16, he worked for the Mafeking Town Council, and I have an invitation that admits him to a visit by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales in June 1925. He was only 17 at the time. I was told that he was the town treasurer, but I doubt this is true. He probably just worked in that department, but he was very good at numbers. When I asked my father how come he ended up in Northern Rhodesia, he told me that whilst growing up in Mafeking, he saw a poster at the railway station advertising the famous Victoria Falls, one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. The falls are 1.25 miles wide and 400 feet deep. It looked like a beautiful place to him, and he decided that when he was old enough and had saved up enough money, he would make his way up there. It was a distance of 780 miles from Mafeking. It was also the border between Northern and Southern Rhodesia, now called Zambia and Zimbabwe. So whilst travelling up towards the north, he first worked in a coal mining town called Wenki, now called Wengi, in Southern Rhodesia for a Jewish family called Gordon, probably someone from Tells. It was at this time that my dad became very good friends with Roy Walensky, who was a boxer as well as being a shunter on the railways. Walensky was a self-taught man of paternal Jewish descent and later went on to become Prime Minister of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland. That's before it became Zambia and Zimbabwe. My dad and him remained good friends throughout their lives. And this is a letter from Walensky prior to him becoming Prime Minister, and you can see that he referred to my dad as Sossi, a name that stuck with my dad his whole life. And further down you can see that he's been, I believe I'm to go on to Washington because the American government have extended an invitation to me to do so. And then this is a letter that's more formal when you can see right at the top right-hand corner, he has now become Prime Minister. So eventually my father settled in the town of Livingston, 7 miles from the Victoria Falls. It was a big tourist attraction, and young single Jews from all over Northern and Southern Rhodesia would congregate there over the long holiday weekends. It was there that he met my mother, who was also very musical as well as theatrical. They both played in a band at the famous Victoria Falls Hotel. So there's my dad on his violin, and my mother, well, you can see she was very theatrical. She loved all shows and put on shows and sang, and, you know, it was just loved all that. My parents married in 1935. My sister Marion was born in 1938, and I was born in Livingston in 1945. At that time, Livingston was a small, vibrant town, mostly because it was the tourist capital of Central Africa, as well as being the gateway to the north. It was on the main railway line, so good for trade. My father started off with a grocery store referred to as the PSA, Public Services Association, which over the years he extended to include ladies' and men's clothing, children's wear, toys, hardware, and haberdashery. He was also a General Motors dealer, as well as supplying Johnson's outboard motors from Milwaukee for the many speedboats on the Zambezi River, which was a very popular activity. He named his company Sossie's Garage. As I said, he was called Sossie. This photo is taken when the British royal family visited Livingston, Northern Rhodesia, in 1947. That is the late King George VI in white, and his wife was the late Queen Mother, and accompanying them were the two princesses Elizabeth, now the present Queen, and her sister Margaret. My dad loved the big American cars and always had either a Buick, Pontiac, or Oldsmobile, which were his pride and joy. My dad also ran the cinema, the only one in town, which showed 5 different movies in a week. Dad was very much an entrepreneur who was involved in an assortment of many other businesses. Excuse me. This is the main street of Livingston, and you can see that the streets were very wide, which was to enable the ox wagons to turn around. My cousin Cliff will talk in a later presentation about his father Louis, as well as my father's other 2 siblings, Janie and Philip. But in the meantime, sadly, my father's youngest brother, Philip, was tragically killed fighting in the Second World War. And this is a newspaper cutting my father had that is in the paper. Here is another photograph I've got, which is Philip, my mother, and a friend. And for those that know Leon, who is in Australia, he looks so like Philip. When I first saw it, I thought it was Leon, but then realized it couldn't possibly be him. But it's an amazing, what's the word? Whatever. They look so alike. The next photo is Janie, my father's only sister. She married Murray Friedland. And then this is a photo of the South African young cousins in Johannesburg in the early 50s. You'll see Marion in the square at the top. She was at boarding school in Johannesburg, although we lived in Zambia. And there's Bernie, Jeff, and Cliff, and Myrna, Brian. I think it's Phyllis, unless it might be Sandra, actually, I just thought. I don't know. But maybe the cousins will be able to shed more light. And then this photo is Marion a few years later, but in the late 50s, our cousin Jeff Sussin, who came to the reunion, and my sister Marion, down, I think it's the main street, Elof Street in Johannesburg. My father was also an excellent letter writer and was very good at keeping in touch with his many relatives in the USA. This is a letter from Harry, my father, who was a nephew to Barney's wife Fanny, written in 1954. This was before our trip to the States, when we met them all in person. Cousin Warren Sussin gave me a copy of this letter when we visited him in Rhinebeck, not long before Warren passed away. It just shows you that Sussins hoard things like this, which is great if you want to do family history. And these are a selection of photos that the American cousins must have sent to Dad, as I found them amongst his belongings after Dad passed away. Now, we know that in 1933 they took that family photograph at a picnic, and so I think this is at the same time. And again, I've sort of written the names of it. I think they are, but you can always come back to me if you think I'm wrong and have a look at them more closely at a later stage. This photograph, actually, written on the back of the photograph, it says that the house was Max Con's house and that it was estimated to have cost $30,000 in the 1930s, a large amount of money then, and was reputed to be one of the nicest houses in Minnesota. And these are more cousins of that generation, of my dad's generation, getting together in Minneapolis. So getting back to Zambia, my father was very much a big fish in a small pond. This is a photo of my parents, Marion and I, probably taken in about 1948. Our first home was very modest with no indoor plumbing, and so the toilet was in a little hut at the back of the yard, referred to as the PK, which stands for Pikanini Kaya in the African language, meaning small house. Everyone in the street had these outdoor toilets, and a truck used to go down a lane that ran alongside the back of the houses in the middle of the night collecting the buckets. I remember that toilet very, very well. When I was about 8, my parents built a lovely modern home with a guest house and swimming pool, and the house was aptly called Melody, with both my parents being musical. So that's the house. Up there is a big veranda, and they had a dance floor, a pool, and then this photo on the other side of the pool was a guest house. Now on the front veranda, my father had a bar with a big sign saying Sossie's Bar. At sundown, after work, many friends would come to our house for drinks, which was a popular pastime in Central Africa. Passers-by would often stop and ask what time the bar opened, and to their dismay discovered it was private and not open to the public. Now a bit about the Jewish community. Livingston was the first town in Northern Rhodesia to establish a Jewish community. The synagogue, which eventually had a hall, a Hebrew school, and a rabbi's house, was established in 1928. Although I went to a convent school, I attended Hebrew school and was very involved in Jewish social life. And this is a photograph. That was Reverend Slappak, who was the rabbi in Livingston. And again, I've tried to name most of the kids. Some of you may recognize them. And then this is obviously a Hanukkah celebration. And again, all the little kids who were living in Livingston, or the ones that went to Hebrew school. There are no more Jews living in Livingston. However, Peter Jones, who owns the River Club Lodge in Livingston, has taken an interest in the history of the Jewish community and actually offers Jewish tours of Livingston, which are very popular with the Jewish tourists. There's also now a Jewish museum in Livingston, which opened earlier this year. I think that's amazing. So with Livingston being a very popular tourist resort, we had many visitors who came to stay with us in the guest house. The lifestyle was very easy and comfortable because of the amount of domestic help families had living in that part of the world. We had a Polish housekeeper, as well as a cook, 2 domestic helpers, and 2 gardeners. However, both my parents worked very hard to build up their respective businesses. And there's a photograph of my mother, and obviously there were some friends there, and Arkyem, who was one of the domestic helpers, is holding the tray ready for my mother to serve tea. And just by the way, I'm still in touch with Arkyem, who is the man holding the tray. And when we visited in 2013, just a couple of years ago, with my children and grandchildren, we met up with Arkyem and his grandson. And I've always managed to see him and met his children over the years when we've gone back to Livingston. To add to our regular guests, my father also had a very influential friend in South Africa, John Schlesinger, who was connected to the movie and theatre world and referred many celebrities who visited the Victoria Falls to my parents. This gave them a wonderful opportunity to show these celebrities around the falls as well as entertain them in our home. Many came from the United States, such as the film director Alfred Hitchcock, and there he is with his wife and my dad, and also the very popular film star and entertainer of the time, Danny Kaye. I can clearly remember when Danny Kaye came to our home for tea and he asked me to get him a pen. He sat me on his lap, drew a little face on his thumb, and then sang Thumbelina to me. My dad and I also flew by plane with him, and they had a special plane for him and all his staff, to Bulawayo in Zimbabwe, the next biggest city. And as we were disembarking, he asked my dad if I could ride with him, just the two of us, in an open-air car through the crowded streets of Bulawayo. What a treat that was. I was about 9 years old at the time, and he was a huge celebrity in the 50s. Amongst my dad's belongings were some interesting letters from many of the visitors that he communicated with. This is a letter from Virginia Kettering of General Motors and the Sloan Kettering Hospital, and that's a letter from the Los Angeles Dodgers after the U.S. baseball team actually visited Livingston, also mentioning Peter Crindler from the 21 Club. Both Peter and Jeanette Crindler became good friends of my parents as well as my sister Marion, and often visited us in later years in London. This is a letter from George Moore, who mentions his friends, Mr. and Mrs. Henry Ford. I don't recall whether they came to Livingston or not. Together with the many interesting visitors, my parents had a great social life living in Livingston. There was no television at that time in Africa, and so people provided their own entertainment. Both being musical, they would often have jam sessions at home, as well as playing in a band for local dancers. This is a photo of my dad playing with Sussin's band at the Victoria Hall in Livingston. Another pastime was cruising down the river on a Sunday afternoon. My dad had a river launch named Isabel after my mother, and of course we have a daughter, Isabel, and we would often take guests up and down the river viewing the wild game on the riverbanks. There were always plenty of elephants, giraffes, hippos, crocodiles, etc. to be seen. My mother was also a terrific organizer, and together they ran many huge charity events at their home, sometimes for a couple of hundred people, raising funds for Israel, the war effort, medical conditions, etc. My mother would train the local girls in dance routines, and here is a photo of the Cancun Girls. I think that's sitting on the counter at Sossie's bar, and that's Marion right in the front at the bottom. In the early 50s, my mother became ill with a paralysis on her right side, and the doctors in Africa did not know the cause. So in 1957, when I was 11, my parents and I undertook a very big trip abroad. It was primarily to seek medical attention for my mother, but at the same time, we were the first of the African branch of the Shussin family to visit our many Sussin as well as Warees relatives scattered across the USA. We sailed from London to New York and then spent 4 months traveling across the US. We acquired a Chevrolet station wagon from General Motors and set off on a 15,000-mile trip. We started off in New York, first visiting Marilyn and Warren Sussin and their family in Rhinebeck, then on to Montreal, the Niagara Falls, of course, Detroit, Chicago, Minneapolis, the most important place to visit, and then on to Yellowstone, Las Vegas, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Grand Canyon, New Orleans, Miami, and back to New York. So these are several photos that you can look through. I'm going to move on, that were taken around the table. There was a dinner party in Minneapolis, and those were all the photos. We obviously spent quite a bit of time in Minneapolis, and I personally spent a few days staying with Toby and Ralph Levin and their 5 children in Marengo, Illinois. Their youngest, Seth, was not yet born. For some reason, I vividly remember learning to play spin the bottle at their house. I also recall meeting Leslie Desnick, who impressed me with his ski jumping antics. and Judy Sussin introducing me to an eyelash curler. It is amazing what sticks in one's mind. One of my favorite moments was going to the Minnesota State Fair and getting a front page of a newspaper printed with the words "Beverley Sossen kisses Elvis Presley," which, as you can imagine, caused quite a sensation when I returned to school back in Central Africa. As my sister Marion was unable to visit the States with us in 1957 because of an important time in her schooling, she did do a trip herself a few years later, visiting many of the family. When I met Sandra Breitenberger at the reunion, she remembered meeting Marion. Marion also lived in New York for a few years in the early 60s before moving to London. These are a few extra photos of our family getting together after our big trip in the USA. That's Bella with Bloomy, who I think was living in Germany at the time, and Dave Shussin, who visited Mary and I. We were already living in London in 1967 or 68. And that's my dad with his brother Louis. And then, as I explained earlier on, in 1964, just 6 years after our trip to the US, Zambia gained independence from Britain under the leadership of President Kenneth Kaunda. And here's a photo of my dad with the president and his wife and the manager. And I think this must have been Zambia Textiles, which my father was now involved in. As Zambia started to decline in the 60s, my parents packed up and finally left Livingstone for good in 1969. Although the doctors in the UK and the US were unable to help with my mother's paralysis, her condition did not deteriorate further for another 13 years after our trip abroad. She became ill just as they were packing up in Livingstone, and she sadly passed away in Johannesburg a year later in 1970, aged 60. 3 years later, my father remarried Esther Costa, whom he met in London, and they were married for about 20 years. They spent half the year in London and the other half in South Africa. My dad passed away in London in 1992, aged 85, and my stepmother Esther only passed away this last year. In the mid-80s, Peter, myself, and Isabel visited Shirley and Harley Resnick in their home in Fort Myers. Shirley's the daughter of Charlie. As well as my dad, I also kept in touch with some of the family even before we moved to the States. My sister Marion and I visited Minneapolis for Alex Desnick's bar mitzvah in the year 2000, and I returned to Minneapolis in 1908 for Toby Levin's 90th birthday party. Here is a more up-to-date picture of my sister Marion. So for Peter and I, after flying backwards and forwards across the pond over several years, visiting our children and then our grandchildren as they started to arrive on the scene, we decided that with both our children and all our grandchildren living in the US, it was time to leave London and make our home in the United States. We now live in Boston, well actually Newton, which is part of the greater Boston area. So this is Peter and I with our grandchildren, our children and our grandchildren, Isabel and Simon, Simon's wife Marla, Izzy's husband Rob, and they're the 4 grandchildren because Oshri wasn't there, and this is the 5th grandchild, Oshri the eldest, and I decided I couldn't leave him out, so put that photo in. And last of all, the 2 sisters, Marion and Bev. Our move to the States has been a great success, and I suppose, having gone full circle, I am now officially one of the American Sossens. Lastly, let me just say how thrilled I was to be at the great Sussin Sussin family reunion this past August, which would not have come about without the fabulous initiative and drive of our dear cousin, Barbara Levin. At this time, I would also like to remember very fondly Barbara's mother, Toby Levin, who unconditionally loved our whole Shussin Sussin family and kept in constant touch with so many of us before she sadly passed away at age 94. She was truly an amazing lady, and I know is very much missed by so many of us. I'm sure that many of our Sussin ancestors are smiling and looking down on us in disbelief that we managed to gather so many strands of the family together and united us all once again at the family reunion in Minneapolis this past August in 2015. They must also be totally in awe of the amazing technology that Barbara has been such a whiz at putting together, which has enabled us to have our Shussin, Sussin website, as well as produce these amazing webinars. So once again, a big thank you to Barbara for continually putting this all together, and thank you to all of you out there in cyberspace who signed up for this family history presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you, Bev, and you're much too gracious. And didn't I promise this would be terrific? And it was. Now, one of these questions I have from Leon, and he wanted to know about your mother, where she was born.
Okay, my mother was actually born in Bulawayo and moved to Livingston when she was 3 months old, and she was the second longest living white resident, European resident in Livingston. She lived there. Well, she died at 16. She left the year before, so she'd lived there for 59 years in Livingston, so she was very well known in the town.
Ah, that's great. I'm going to unmute. I have someone who I think you may know, Peter Olsberg, who had a question, and I'm going to unmute him and ask him to repeat it for us. Peter, you should be unmuted at this point.
Are you sure it's me? Because I didn't ask for that.
Well, you raised your hand, but that's all right. I will go ahead and unmute everybody. And if anybody else has questions, although it was very comprehensive, Bev, and I think you answered a lot of questions. I do want to repeat that I will be sending everybody who's registered a link to the recording. It will be password protected, but it won't be any problem to ask. Now, people are unmuted here. We do have, besides our special guests, we do have representatives from the Jacob Shussin family, from the Gitamara family, from the certainly from the Sussin family, and as well as a couple other special guests. So everyone should be unmuted at this point. So if anybody else has questions for Bev, please feel free.
I just want to make a statement, if I may, Barbara.
Oh, of course. This is Cliff from from sunny Sydney. Please go ahead.
I just wanted to say to Beverley, what an outstanding, incredible amount of information. The research that you've done will hold us as a family. It's just added so much value to our lives, and I'm sure to our children's and our grandchildren's lives, that kind of information. So well done to you. Well done for the presentation. It was really marvelous. And I thank you so much for going through all that trouble. It really is outstanding, and I commend you for it. Thank you so much.
Well, here. I agree. Do we have another question?
It's Helen Ikowitz.
Hi, Helen.
Hello, Helen. How are you, Helen?
Hi. It's not a question, but I am just flabbergasted. I second Cliff. It's amazing the information you got and how you put it together and how you wove it together. It's just really amazing. And Barbie, for you doing all the work, I am speechless, but I am speechless at this point. It was really, thank you so much.
Well,
thank you.
Yes, and again, too gracious for me. Truly, it was Beverly who put this all together, and I just pushed a couple buttons. But thank you. Lev, I have, this is Bev's grandson. I have you still asking a question. Do you have one?
Yeah.
Please.
Hi, Lev.
Hi. How old were you when you started the researching?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. How old was I when what?
You started researching.
When I started researching, well, probably about 25 years ago, and you know how old I am just this week.
Suddenly.
I was 45.
That's
But
wonderful.
if you're interested, this is the time to ask questions. But you've heard me talk about this a lot, so I think you know quite a bit. And I've done books for the kids, and I'm going to put this together as well for them because having done the work, I thought that they have it. They may not be interested so much now, but, you know, after time, you do become interested, as I said, and then often it's too late. And with the technology that there is today, it's so easy to put things together, to make albums and whatever, recordings. It's great. Thank you, Dev. I was, 45.
Well, you can start earlier, Lev.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Marion.
Hi, Marion.
Hi,
Hello.
sister. Hi, sister.
This is Bev's. Hi. Well done, Beverly. This was really fantastic. And actually, what's interesting for me is there's a lot of information that I didn't even know about.
Right.
So we'll be regularly grabbing all this information from you and taking photocopies. But it was really very interesting. And I've got Liz here with me, who's just been fascinated by all of this. And so she'll get onto her family tree soon.
Kudos to you, Bev. It was amazing. Quite amazing.
Well, I'm pleased you enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, it was really great, and it would be great if we could get this out to some of the other family. I'm sorry, I've just got back from Maine, so I don't know if you got on to Ronnie early enough, but I'm sure she would be interested. And actually, I'd like to know if Karen and Les are there today.
They are not.
I don't know.
They are not here. They're not here today, but they will get a recording of this if you wish to send them a message.
Well, I'll give her a call.
Some people registered and they will get the recording.
And do they need to register to get the recording? Because I'm sure we have Bianca, who's at the World Rugby in London at the moment, and I'm sure she's out with all her gang tonight, but I'm sure she would be interested.
That's not a problem. We can get things to people if they're really interested.
Absolutely.
Okay, and one of my suggestions is that this should definitely go into the Jewish Museum in Livingston.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a great idea. And if you wish, Bev, we can talk about that if you want to send an earlier recording that does not have questions.
Right.
Not that I'm negating anybody's questions, but just to make it a little more succinct. And just to reiterate, anybody who wants a recording, they are password protected, and you will be getting a link probably tomorrow, and it's from Vimeo, which everybody should be able to access. If you have problems, let me know. But it's password protected, but if Bev doesn't mind, I'll run it past her, and if there are other people that wish to see it, I will certainly send them a link. We just, it's our ersatz security system to make it password protected.
One thing I want to say is, I can only go by what I found through the records, but they're not always 100% accurate with dates and things. And as I said, they often guessed their birth dates. For instance, my father, we always celebrated, this is a funny story, we always celebrated my father's birthday on the 20th of March. He was born 1908. And my mother, who was interested in astrology, said he was a typical Piscean, and we all agreed. And it was only after he died and I got the information from the records that he was actually born December the 7th, 1907. So it just shows you that you can believe what you read. But I'm glad I didn't find that out until after my dad died, because he was quite vain, my father, and he would have been very upset that he was born 1907 and not 1908.
That's funny.
Yeah, but that's what happens, What?
Simon's here.
Oh, Simon's there. Good.
All right, well, is there anyone else?
Barbara, it's Peter here.
Oh.
I do have a question now.
Excellent.
When's our life going to get back to normal?
Oh. Well, if these people would quit reproducing and in and enhancing this family, perhaps Peter, someone else should speak to that one. Good question, though. I love all these Americans with these British accents. But that's all right. Thank goodness for Helen. Otherwise, we would never hear it. Does anyone else have anything to say? Actually, I have a question. It's for Cliff, who will be doing the next presentation once we arrange it. But Cliff, did you say you were on your way to Melbourne for another bar mitzvah?
Yeah, what's interesting for me is that last night we celebrated the bat mitzvah of it's Janie's. Beverley referred to Janie, who was my father's sister, as well as Harry's sister, and it was her great-granddaughter's bat mitzvah last night, which we celebrated in Sydney, which was beautiful. And this weekend I'm driving all the way to Melbourne to celebrate Leon's granddaughter's bat mitzvah.
Oh, nice.
So it's share all these simchas with the Sussins that emanated from Elchonon and now are scattered around the world.
Absolutely.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And isn't it wonderful with technology that we can, get together?
Yeah, indeed. My presentation, I would recommend if we do it in about a month's time. If that's okay with you, Barbara.
Oh, of course. I live to serve the rest of you.
Okay. As I say, I've completed my presentation. It really needs now just to be refined after what I've heard the way Beverley's presented hers. There's just a few little tweaks I'd like to do. And then, but mine is pre-recorded, so I've got it's all recorded and I can send it on to you, and we can either do that or I can do it personally, whichever way suits. We'll talk about that later.
We can talk about it, but I agree with you that Beverley has set a high bar for the rest of us in presenting this. Also, I reiterate what I said in the introduction. Beverley, certainly after my mother died, may she rest in peace, Beverley and Cliff and Helen, they were just my lights in the storm, helping me get through it. And I never thought that void could be filled until I met all of you. And it was just remarkable. And it was solidified at the reunion, which I still think about and think was yesterday, but I realize it was months ago at this point. So I also wanted to mention that as a result of this webinar, we have gotten more in touch with the Goldfine family, who a couple of whom have contacted me out of Johannesburg, and we'll see if we can get more of them onto our next meeting. Anyway, it is 5:04 here in the United States in the afternoon, and I will conclude this unless anyone has anything else to say, and everyone is unmuted at this point, so feel free.
Yes, well done to you, Barbie, for putting this all together. I'm very, very impressed, and I think it's a grand job.
Oh, well, that's very kind. I didn't unmute everybody for that reason, but thank you.
No, but it wouldn't have happened if you hadn't set this up, and my sister hadn't done what she'd done.
Oh.
So, fantastic.
Well, this has been fun. I am hoping during the winter months here in the States, that on some of those long winter months, people have been starting to send me their home movies, and I'm hoping to have kind of a movie afternoon where we can just talk over other people's home movies. So feel free to let me know or send me anything if you wish. But meanwhile, I will let everyone go. Bev, once again, everybody is so appreciative. This was absolutely incredible, and you did such a wonderful job, and I learned something. I have seen it a couple times now. I've learned something every single time. So I think people will be thrilled when they get a link to this. And all of you who have attended, I thank you very much. And unless anyone has any objections, I'm going to end this for everyone. And we'll see you next time. I'll add all the new emails to our list. And I thank you all very, very much for coming. And thank you, Bev, particularly.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.